Hi, Mr. Botany here with our first botany lesson on what is a plant? What makes a plant a plant? So let's get right into it here. What are some of the properties that we find in all plants? First and foremost, plants must be autotrophic. That means that they make their own food. They are producers. Plants do photosynthesis by collecting in materials from their environment, carbon dioxide and water primarily, and then sunlight is their energy source that they then use to convert that over into glucose and other sugars, which is then their food, which is the exact opposite of what you and I do. We're consumers where we bring things in from our environment. Those are our food. We don't make our own food like plants do. All plants are autotrophic. There are some plants that do some consumption, right? Like a Venus flytrap or a pitcher plant. They'll bring some materials in for nutrition, but that's not still, it's not the main form on how they get their food. They still do photosynthesis. By definition, all plants are autotrophic first. All plants must be multicellular. That means they're made of more than just one cell. In fact, it's lots and lots of cells, but this eliminates algae. Algae is not a plant. Algae is a protist. It is a single-celled protist that oftentimes can form together in big colonies, but it's not a plant by definition because algae is unicellular. Plants must be multicellular, making them a bit more complex. Next is that all plants have cell walls in their cellular structure that have a chemical component called cellulose in it. Cellulose is a complicated polysaccharide. A polysaccharide is a type of carbohydrate or a type of sugar. It's where you take many individual glucoses, which are the product of photosynthesis, and they get linked together in a chain, end to end to end to end, and it forms this really big and complex structure, which is really good for building with. So plants use it to build their cell walls with. And it makes their cell walls very strong and gives a lot of rigidity to them. It also makes it so that plant cells are hard to digest, which is why we rely upon some help to digest plant cells in the form of bacteria that lives inside of your digestive system. So you should always chew your plant cells very well. Another thing that all plants do, as I mentioned earlier, is they do photosynthesis. This happens inside of the chloroplast, inside of cells that can do photosynthesis, and they convert carbon dioxide and water with the aid of some sunlight over into glucose and then oxygen gas. All plants must have these characteristics in order for them to be considered a plant. If they have all of these characteristics, well, then it's a plant. Here's a picture of, or an animation, I guess, of a typical plant cell with some of the cell parts that we'll get into throughout the course of this course. And in here, you're going to first notice that the majority of the cell volume is taken up by this blue structure here, which is a vacuole, which is used for storage. Plants don't move around, so they need to be able to store things like water for long periods of time, and they can take up large portions of the volume. They've got a nucleus and an endoplasmic reticulum, and here's a chloroplast up here, and they have mitochondria like you'll find in many other types of eukaryotic cells, but they are made of cells like all other living things, and these are eukaryotic varieties of cells, which are one of the more complex types of cells. Typically, plants go through a life cycle, which is shown here. So we can start at any point in this. So let's start with the mature plant. And the mature plant will produce seeds, in this case through a flower, and then that seed will then be spread, and then that spreaded seed will germinate or sprout to become a new plant. And then here's our new seedling, which will eventually over time grow back into a mature plant. And this process can happen over and over and over again. Now, not all plants do what we saw in that cycle there. There are some plants that reproduce using spores, which is a completely different cycle than what we saw there. And of course, there can be a sexual and asexual component thrown in here as well, where we can combine genetics from two separate plants, or where one plant can just reproduce all by itself. More on that in future videos. So where did plants come from an evolutionary standpoint? And really, the first plants are very likely evolved from algae. It makes sense for them to have been evolved from algae. Well, because algae are a lot like plants. They do photosynthesis, and they make their own food, and they contain chloroplasts, just like what we see inside of plants. Now, algae, as I mentioned before, is not a plant. It is a plant-like protist. We think the very first plants would have evolved around 500 million years ago, and we actually think the first plants would have been land plants, very similar to that of moss. Now, these plants moving on to land needed to have some distinct advantages or traits separate from what algae would have to deal with, right? If you're algae, you're living in the water. So there's water available to you all the time. So you don't really need to have a way to store water. Land plants do. They need to be able to store water for long periods of time because they're no longer living in it. Another is this resistant to the drying rays of the sun. When you're in the water will diffuse and refract the light, so it's not so intense on you all the time. When you're on the land, you don't have that. So you get a more intense sunlight, which can cause plants to dry up and burn out faster. And then, of course, they need to be able to survive long periods of time without water. Again, they're not living in it. They need to be able to store it. When we talk about plant diversity, this is where we categorize plants into different taxonomical groups based upon their features. So taxonomy is just the classification of any living thing. In this case, we're going to specifically focus on plant diversity. And there are 4 major types of plants. The first are mosses or bryophytes. Those are the least complex and the oldest variety of plants. Then there is ferns or Polypodiophyta. We'll call them ferns because that's just easier. A little bit more complex. They have some additional features in them than moss, but still not a very complex type of plant. Gymnosperms or conifers, or as many people refer to them as evergreens, a bit more complex, and they use some advanced ways of reproducing with cones. And then finally, our most complex, most varied, and by far most populous variety of plants are angiosperms, or our flowering plants. This right here is what we consider a cladogram. It shows an evolutionary path of plants and shows why they branched and where they branched. So if we start down here at our ancestor of algae, we then get into our first break. And really what we could add in here that's not on this image is that these mosses are multicellular, whereas the algae are not. So our first branching that happens to take us into this class of plants here is that these ones are multicellular. And that means that everything going this way is multicellular as well, but they have some additional features. This first one is water conducting or vascular tissue. More on that in a few minutes. And that means that then everything after that point has that. Ferns and their relatives have vascular tissue. More on that soon. After that point, we get to the production of seeds, meaning that every other plant after this point will produce seeds. So that means both cone-bearing or conifers and flowering plants both use seeds. Now, cone-bearing plants use cones and flowering plants use flowers. But if we follow this cladogram, if we take a look at flowering plants, we know that flowering plants are multicellular. They have vascular tissue. They make seeds, and they do that by the production of flowers. This cladogram just shows the major evolutionary steps that we see within plants. This diagram here does the exact same type of thing, and it's very cleverly, they've made it into a tree. And so again, you start off down here with your varieties of algae, which then evolved into our plants, our land plants, and here's our first variety of land plants here, which are mosses and bryophytes, and then their cousins. And then we get into the ferns and their relatives, and then here are our conifers, and then here are our flowering plants, showing the differentiations between all of them along the way. So let's talk a little bit about mosses. Again, these are our least complex form of plant. They have no major vascular system at all, so which means they are not good at moving things around inside them. A vascular system inside of you consists of your arteries and your veins and your capillaries, a system to move materials around. Many plants have that. Mosses lack that. And so because they don't have that system to move materials throughout their body, they're typically very small. They have simple root structures, and they don't need a whole lot in terms of nutrient requirements, which is why you'll find them growing in some unique places like on rocks or on the bark of a tree. In fact, mosses are oftentimes considered a pioneer species. In the process of what we call ecological succession, where new landforms and living environments are created, soil needs to be created, right? If we think about all the way back to the beginning of when life came onto land, hundreds of millions of years ago, not billions of years ago, land was just rock. Now, plants can't grow on just rock unless you're a very simplistic plant like mosses. So what the mosses would do is they would grow on this rock. Their little tiny roots would work their way into the cracks in the rock, and the plants would go through their life cycle. They would live, they would die, and then you would have dead moss. Well, in combination of bacteria and broken down rock, now you start to form this very thin layer of soil, which would get bigger and bigger over time, right? So what mosses do is they can actually generate soil. So if left to nature, right, a parking lot eventually would turn back into soil through the action of plants like mosses and lichen, because they can live in places that are low nutrient requirement and survive. And again, they were very likely our very first type of plant that made it onto land because of the way in which they can live, because there was no soil to begin with on land, and they can live in environments like that. Our next variety of our major type of plants are ferns. Now, these are slightly more complex, specifically because they have the addition of a vascular system. So they have a set system that will move materials around inside of their bodies. This means that they can send water and they can send sugars, which are the main things that get moved around inside of a plant, to specific locations. It can be made in the leaves and then transported back down to the roots where it can be stored. And it just allows the plants to be physically bigger, right? If you're a larger plant, you need to move water up against gravity, you need a system that can do that. I think a great analogy for thinking about a vascular system is thinking about it as like a system of tubes or a system of straws, microscopic straws at that can move things around inside of a plant. Now, ferns reproduce using spores as well as mosses. They also use spores to reproduce. This is a more simplistic way of reproduction. In fact, when we take a look inside of this is the bottom side of what we call a fern frond. Ferns don't have technical leaves. They call the leaves of a fern a frond. Anyway, this is the bottom side of it. All of these brown dots here are clusters of spores. And so inside of each one of these clusters, you'll find thousands, if not millions, of individual spores. Now, those spores, just a single one of them, can become a new plant, can become a new fern. Now, these spores typically get carried away through the action of rain falling down and hitting the top side of the fronds and then carrying the spores away. But those spores have to land in the perfect place in order for them to sprout. If they don't land in a good spot that has water and sunlight and the correct nutrition, they'll never become a fern. In fact, the vast, vast, vast majority of spores that are produced by a fern or a moss for that instance, they never become plants. So this method of reproduction is just throw everything at it. Let's make as many spores as possible and just hope that some of them will actually make it. Then we move on to a little bit more of a complicated let's talk about vascular systems first. So in this image here, I've got a plant, and in it, I've got some numbers. So let's take a look at number one. In number one, what we have is we have a root structure, and that root structure is taking water up into it through a structure that we call the xylem. And the xylem is indicated in blue, and that's helpful because we're moving water around. Then in system two, that water is being transported into the leaves where photosynthesis can take place. And we see that happening up here as well. Then in three, what's happening is the leaves then do photosynthesis. And this red system is called the phloem. It moves sugar water, essentially, or sap is another way you could refer to it, back into the plant. Now, that can go a couple places. It can go down here into the roots, which is what we have happening in 4, where it can be stored, or it can be shifted up into new structures, like these new leaves that are growing for new growth, and then, of course, to the tip of the stem, which is what we see happening in 6. So the vascular system is a system that is designed to be able to move things around effectively inside of the plant. And it provides some very distinct advantages to it. They can be taller, as I had mentioned, which allows them to grow higher off the ground, which means they have access to more sunlight, therefore outcompeting their neighbors. Really, a fern is going to outcompete moss every day because it's taller than it, which means it's going to get more sunlight and therefore be able to survive better. Plants compete just like animals compete. It's just over a slower pace. The vascular system also allows for nutrient and water storage, which means that they can keep and hold on to water and nutrients in times of need, like the winter, for example, and they get to sending nutrients exactly where they need to go. So when the plant is growing, it can send nutrients to the site of growth, or if a plant gets damaged and needs to repair that damage, it can send nutrients specifically to that area of damage so that the healing process can happen faster. All right, let's move on to conifers now, or as another way that we like to refer to them as evergreens. These are plants that keep their leaves or needles year-round. Most of them have needle-like leaves, although there are some varieties that have flat leaves. Specifically, ginkgos have flat leaves. They look like a fan that you would use to fan yourself with. More on those a little bit later. And all conifers, or gymnosperms is their technical term, use cones to reproduce. Now, within those cones, they do produce seeds Maybe you've never noticed them before, but there are seeds that get produced inside of cones. Now, there are two types of cones. The first that's pictured here, these are male cones. And now what male cones do is they produce pollen. The male cones are much smaller and they're much softer, and they break down and fall off of the plant after the spring is over with. So you may have never seen a male cone before, or maybe you've noticed them and then they're gone shortly then thereafter. The type of cones that you're most familiar with are female cones. These are the larger and the more woody type of cones. These are the ones that actually store and hold on to the seeds. And in fact, for most conifers, it takes 2 years for their seeds to develop. In the first year, they'll be green and closed up, and that's when they're developing their seeds. And the second year, they'll turn the brown color, they'll open up their scales, and then they'll drop their seeds down. You'll typically find the female cones towards the tops of the branches and the male cones towards the bottom of the branches. Now, all conifers are wind pollinated, which means as the wind blows by, it'll carry pollen from a male cone through the air, and then it needs to land on a female cone in order for it to be pollinated. That is sexual reproduction. When you have the joining of male reproductive cells, which is pollen, or plant sperm in this case, with female reproductive cells, which are the egg cells found inside the female cones, that's sexual reproduction. You're combining the genetics of two separate plants to make seeds that will then grow into a brand new plant that has different genetics from both of the parents. The last and most complex variety of plants are flowering plants, and they're distinguished because they do use flowers for their reproduction. They are by far the most diverse form of plants, and they're what we find just the vast majority all over the world right now are flowering plants. There's two major types of flowering plants, and those are monocots, like this lily pictured here, and dicots or eudicots. I just refer to them as dicots. The name has changed within recent years, but I still stick with dicots, like the sunflower here. So some distinguishing features that we see with flowering plants, again, going back and focusing on the flower component of it, is that these are the structures that are used in order to make new plants. If you take a look at this lily here, you can see it pretty well. There are two distinct features. There's this one in the middle here, which is called a carpel or a pistil. It is the female reproductive component of a flower. And then these smaller ones here, these brown ones that have the brown end and these long filaments, these are called stamen. And they are the male reproductive component of a flower. So what needs to happen is pollen from the stamen needs to get to a pistil or a carpel, the female reproductive part. Some plants can self-pollinate, which means pollen from this structure can make it onto this pistil, and then from there it can produce seeds. Some plants require cross-pollination, which means this pollen would have to have come from another plant. Therefore, I don't have to be the same type of lily, right? It's not like I could pick up pollen from an apple tree. The pollen here would have to be a pollen from a separate lily plant, and then it makes its way onto this pistil. Now, how does it get there? Well, that's the process of pollination. There's lots of different ways, right? It could be carried by a pollinator, like a bee or a bird. And now you know why they call it the birds and the bees. It's because of plants, right? So what's happening here is the bee is carrying pollen from one plant to another, and then sexual reproduction happens. Birds do this as well. A big one for this is hummingbirds, and specifically hummingbirds with lilies. They like the bright red colors. And these pollinators are visiting these flowers for one reason and one reason only, and that's because of the nectar. Down at the base of the plant, like down in here, plants will produce a sugary substance. That's just sugar water, really. And the pollinators, like bees and birds, visit it to drink that. Now, bees then go and use it to make their honey, which they use to feed their young. Hummingbirds just use it as their food. So they attract in pollinators to then get their pollen moved from one flower to the next. This dramatically increases the likelihood that they will be pollinated, which is why flowering plants have dominated from an evolutionary standpoint, which is why there are way more flowering plants than there are conifers, because they get pollinated significantly more frequently than having to rely upon wind. Now, are there some flowering plants that do rely upon wind? Of course. Grass would be a great example of this. And grass typically flowers late in the year towards the fall. You see those little tassely things that show up on the end of grass? Those are their flowers. And then the wind carries that pollen from one plant to another. And if you have allergies, you get to experience the wonderful symptoms that come along with those as you breathe in that plant pollen and your body's like, no, that shouldn't be here. And then you work to fight it off. But flowering plants, again, by far the most diverse, most complicated, and most common variety of plants that you'll find anywhere on this planet. So in recap, plants need to be autotrophic, which means they need to make their own food. Plants need to be multicellular. They have cell walls, and those cell walls contain cellulose, and they need to do photosynthesis. There's a few major varieties of plants, and we'll get into those varieties in more detail in upcoming lessons, but the least complex varieties are mosses. Then we get a little bit more involved and more complex by adding vascular tissue, and that brings us to ferns. Then from there, we add in the production of seeds. And the first variety that produces seeds are the conifers with their cones. And then finally, we move on to flowering plants, which use flowers and are more diverse. Hope you enjoyed this lesson.